Yeah, good evening and praise the Lord, everyone. Again, it would be great if as many people as possible could switch on their videos. If that's feasible for you, please do that. That'll be great. Yeah, thank you. Last time we studied the life of King Uzziah, and we saw that he was a godly, illustrious, and prosperous. But God struck him down with leprosy when he went in pride to burn incense in the temple. And during Uzziah's early years, Jeroboam too was ruling in the north. That is the last northern king that we studied about. And he died some 14 years before Uzziah. And all the subsequent kings of the northern kingdom of Israel had short tenures, and very little is written about them. So we're going to look at those few kings of northern Israel today. And we also studied last time that Uzziah's last few years were spent as a leper. He was living in isolation, and his son Jotham was handling the affairs of the land. So that's where we will take off today. We will meditate on the life of Jotham in the south, the successor of Uzziah, and then we will go to the north. Even regarding Jotham, there's not much that is written. So that's why I'm including him with the other kings that are there in the north. Okay, so let's begin by reading 2 Chronicles chapter 27. 2 Chronicles chapter 27, verse 2. And he, that is Jotham, did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Uzziah did. However, he did not enter into the temple of the Lord. So it says that Jotham was like his father. Uzziah did many good things, and Jotham also did all those things. But perhaps the author is trying to clarify here that he did not do one big thing that Uzziah did, which was a bad thing, and that is Uzziah entered presumptuously into the temple of the Lord. So Jotham did not do that. Then some of the good things that he did are written. 2 Chronicles chapter 27, right there, verse 3. 3a, that is the first part of verse 3. It says, he built the high gate of the house of the Lord. He built the high gate of the house of the Lord. The temple by now would have not been just a single building, but that temple must have become a big complex. So you have the main structure and lots of subsidiary buildings. Sometimes in our Bible, the word gate refers to an office or a center. But perhaps here it's referring to the ordinary gate only. There were many exits and entries to that big temple complex, and one of them is called the High Gate. That is referred to in the life of Joash also. So he built that high gate. He must have repaired it. And then the second part of verse 3, we are in 2 Chronicles chapter 27. Second part of verse 3, on the wall of Ophel, he built a lot. So Ophel was a ridge of mountains in Jerusalem. As we know, Jerusalem is a hilly place. There are many mountains there. So Ophel is one of the mountains there, ridges of mountains, and Jotham fortified it for the defense of the city. It's an elevated place, strategic place. So he fortified it. So it shows his wisdom and his caution. Then verse 4, moreover, he built cities in the mountains of Judah, and in the forests he built castles or forts and towers. So cities does not mean a metropolis like how our city is, but it means a settlement with some sort of administrative structure and the facilities for keeping a watch. So on the mountains, that is at high altitudes, he built cities. So he made it sure that whatever vantage points were there in the kingdom, they were manned by watchmen. And even in the forests, it says he built castles or forts and towers to watch, and forts to keep provisions, soldiers, to keep people for defense. From here, we understand that it is not just the Jerusalem, the city, that he tried to defend, but he took measures to defend the other parts of his kingdom as well, the other parts of his kingdom. And you can see the emphasis on security. The lot of emphasis is there on security. And the reason was that there were lots of threats from different places. It was a time of threat. And that's why Jotham recognized that time. He had a good understanding of the situation, and that's why he took the appropriate measures. Then verse 5, 2 Chronicles 27:5. He fought also with the king of the Ammonites and prevailed against them. And the children of Ammon gave him the same year 100 talents of silver, 10,000 measures of wheat, 10,000 of barley. So much did the children of Ammon pay unto him, both the second year and the third. So he continued his father's policy of hostility towards the Ammonites. Now, why he went and attacked them is not given. There was a general understanding based on the instructions of Moses that these kings or the people of Israel were not to go and attack these neighboring countries like Ammon, Moab, and all, unless there was a legitimate reason. So whether there was a legitimate reason or not is not given here. But whatever it is, he was successful. So that shows his caliber. It shows how God was with him. In verse 6, it says, Jotham became mighty because he prepared his ways before the Lord his God, and he became prosperous because of the tribute and all the good things that he had done. Then there are some negative things in verse 2, the last part of verse 2. It says, and the people did corruptly. The people were living corrupt lives. Now, the northern kingdom was decaying spiritually. They were in you could say like free fall. Spiritually, the northern kingdom was in free fall. There was a lot of corruption that was taking over the land. And the southern kingdom was not immune to that. This northern influence was coming inside the southern kingdom. And the people of the southern kingdom also were becoming corrupt. The high places were still there. People were sacrificing there. We don't have any record of Jotham interfering in this or trying to stem this tide. There is a bad influence coming from outside. So is there something that we can do for our people to make sure that they don't get corrupted by this bad influence? There's no record of Jotham making any such effort. It says that he did not enter into the temple like his father. So that way he was very careful. But the overall narrative, that the tone that is there here suggests that he was a bit detached. He did not interfere, but he's not supposed to interfere. But he was also very detached. The people were being corrupted. There is no record of any attempt on his part to correct it. No elaboration about anything that he did for the temple worship. He repaired walls that were broken and all that. He did that kind of work, but there's no record of him participating in anything. And we also don't have anything mentioned about his family. But although Jotham was a good man, his son turned out to be really, really very bad. His son turned out to be extremely bad. So that immediately raises a question, what kind of father-son relationship was there? So there is a suspicion on Jotham. We can't say for sure because we don't have the explicit record. But there is a suspicion that he did not participate much. He did not involve himself much. Not much with the house of God, not much with the people of the land, and not much with his own son. His son's name was Ahaz. So that's Jotham. He was a good man, good king. It says he ordered his ways before the Lord. But evidently, he did not do much for the land in terms of spiritual benefits. He fortified it. You can imagine a parent. Sometimes what parents do is they provide everything for their children. I have provided my children with a good home. I have provided them with education. I have provided them with the material things that they need. But have I participated in their life? Have I engaged with them spiritually? In Jotham's case, it seems like he made his forts and he made his towers and he made his walls. He brought a revenue also. So the people were happy. The people were well taken care of. But there doesn't seem to be much spiritual participation. And the lesson for us is this, that maybe many of us are living our lives with nothing very wrong about us. We are not swindling banks. We are not doing any dishonest business practices. We are not having an extramarital affair. We are not going after other gods. But perhaps there is nothing much substantially good either in our lives. And in the case of Jotham, the missing link or the missing element that we can see is participation. And God is asking us if we could participate with other people, participate with our own family, engage with them spiritually, participate in the house of God. It's not just enough to be just proper, don't do what Uzziah did, make sure you do all the right things. But the heartfelt participation of David, we don't see that in Jotham. And participate in the life of the people at large, the people of the land. So Jotham was a leader, but he failed in that respect. So that was the life of Jotham. He had a peaceful, uneventful life. Now we will turn our attention to the northern kingdom. Shall we go to 2 Kings? 2 Kings and chapter 15. Verse 8. 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 8. It says, in the 38th year of Azariah, that is the same as Uzziah, king of Judah, that is Jotham's father, Zechariah, the son of Jeroboam, reigned over Israel in Samaria for 6 months. So Zechariah, remember, is of Jehu's dynasty. Remember, Jehu was the one who took vengeance on the house of Ahab. He had the longest standing dynasty, royal dynasty in Israel. And God told him that because you have obeyed me in executing my judgment on the house of wicked Ahab, therefore I will allow your descendants to rule on the throne till the 4th generation. So after Jehu, there was Jehoahaz, Jehoash, and Jeroboam, whom we studied earlier about. And now there is Zechariah. But he was the last king of Jehu's dynasty, the longest standing dynasty in Israel, according to God's promise. Let us read verse 10, 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 10. And Shallum, the son of Jabesh, conspired against Zechariah and smote him before the people and slew him and reigned in his stead. So here we have the end of Jehu's dynasty. There was a person called Shallum who was actually the king's friend, but he betrayed him. And he killed him, assassinated him, and took over the throne. Now, the news spread in the military that an assassination has taken place and a new person has become the king. So the news spread in the army, and one of the generals was there whose name was Menahem. And Menahem thought to himself, if Shallum can become the king, nicely kill the existing king, and if he can become king, why can't I do the same thing? The throne is up for grabs. Anyone who manages to kill the king becomes the next king. So why can't that person be me? Let us read verse 14. Same chapter, verse 14. For Menahem, the son of Gadi, went up from Tirzah and came to Samaria and smote Shallum, the son of Jabesh in Samaria, and slew him and reigned in his stead. So this was what Menahem did. He said, he was a general of the army stationed some distance away. And then he thought to himself, if Shallum can be the king, why can't I be the king? And so he seized the opportunity. He assassinated Shallum, and thus he became king. Menahem became the king of northern Israel. The question we must ask ourselves is, do we grab something just because it is there for the taking? That is ambition. That is what ambitious people do. If you find that something is there, some post is there, some opportunity is there, do you just grab it just because you find that it is vulnerable, that it is available? Many years before, if you remember, when King Saul died, David was at that time in the land of the Philistines, and David had already been anointed as king of Israel. God had told him that you are the appointed king. But when David found that Saul had died, David did not just rush to the throne. David had some consultation. He had some exchange with the elders of the people of Israel, the leaders of the people, village by village, city by city. And they invited him and said that, we know that you are the one whom God anointed, and you have been the one who has been helping us with the battles. So why don't you come and become our king? And that is how David ascended the throne. David did not grab something just because it was there. And that is the way, that is the manner of a person who is relying on God. I will not take something unless God is giving that to me. And if so, I don't have to grab. That is the attitude of a spiritual man like David. But that was not the attitude of Menahem. And Menahem grabbed the throne. But it happens when you grab positions that not everyone accepts you, right? Some people don't like it when somebody suddenly comes and takes the position. Look at verse 16. Then Menahem smote Tifsah and all those there, and the borders thereof from Tirzah, because they did not open to him. Therefore he smote it, and all the women therein that were with child he ripped up. So many people in the cities of Israel did not accept Menahem as king. And because of that, he hated them and he was cruel to them. He destroyed them and he ripped open the pregnant women that are there. And now you can see that without the fear of God, brutality becomes more and more common. And you will see that in societies and cultures all over the world. Where there is no fear of God, there is no stop there is no check and control for the brutality that people will indulge in. I've often been referring to Josephus, the Jewish historian of the first century, and he writes about Menahem like this. He showed such cruelty for his countrymen as would be unacceptable even towards his conquered enemies. The kind of cruelty which will make people shrink if you show it towards the enemies, the prisoners of war that you have taken. That kind of cruelty he showed to his own countrymen. And Josephus adds that his whole 10-year reign was marked by cruelty. So that is how some people are. They are brutal and they are rough and tough. And without the fear of God, this is the situation. This is the state of affairs that will result. This is the kind of mentality that people will have. I want the throne, and if anyone opposes me, I'm willing to go to any extent against that person. And with all these rough and tough people who are rough and tough at home, we often feel like asking, isn't it? Okay, so you're so rough and tough at home. How are you outside? How are you to the people or to the enemies that are there outside? Let us read verse 19 and 20. 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 19 and 20. And Pul, the king of Assyria, came against the land. And Menahem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver, that his hand might be with him to confirm the kingdom in his hand. And Menahem exacted the money of Israel out of all the mighty men of wealth, of each man 50 shekels of silver, to give to the king of Assyria. So he turned back and stayed not there in the land. Assyria was one of the great empires of the ancient world. Very important, and it comes often in the Bible. And you can describe it this way. It's the icing on the archaeological cake. The icing on the archaeological cake. A lot of artifacts have been found from Assyria. The Assyrian heartland was northern Iraq. If you've followed the news, ISIS-related news, one of the cities where there was a lot of ISIS-related fightings was Mosul in northern Iraq. And all the ancient Assyrian capitals, there was a city called Ashur, which is very ancient, mentioned in Genesis, Kala, and then later on Nineveh was the capital. Nineveh is most often mentioned in the Bible. All these three Assyrian capitals were located very close to Mosul city in Iraq. Okay, so this is the place from where the Assyrians come. And this is the first mention in the Bible of these Neo-Assyrians. I mean, secular historians will refer to this empire as the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This is the first mention in the Bible of a king from this empire. There is perhaps an anonymous reference earlier, a few generations earlier, when Syria was oppressing Israel. It says that God sent a deliverer. We read that verse in 2 Kings chapter 13, verse 5. It says that God sent a deliverer to Israel when the Syrians were oppressing them. That means this deliverer attacked the Syrians. And that deliverer is probably a king called Adad-Nirari III. And he's not mentioned in the Bible, but from the history, he seems to fit that position. So he's probably the unnamed deliverer that is mentioned in 2 Kings 13:5. He besieged Damascus. And in the picture that I sent of him today, that monument that is there, he mentions there that he took tribute from Jehoash, the king of Israel. We studied about Jehoash earlier. So that king, he helped Israel in the sense that he attacked Syria. But in order to keep him happy, Jehoash, the king of Israel, had to give tribute to him. And after that, his successors were weak. And so the people of Israel must have had a holiday from giving their tribute. In fact, in the earlier session, the previous king of Israel that we studied about, his name was Jeroboam II. He was powerful, he was rich, the kingdom was prosperous. They were enjoying themselves because the Assyrian Empire at that time had a low point, a lull in its power. But now we have the new king of Assyria. His name is Pul, and he was a powerful king. He was a powerful king, and he comes up against the land. If you remember that passage in the life of David, when David commits adultery, it says there that the spring is the time when the kings go to war. In ancient times, war was somewhat seasonal. Spring and summer was the time when kings would go to war. And Emperor Pul of Assyria made many innovations, many changes in his administration and his military. He was a reformer in terms of logistics and all that. One of the new things that he brought up is a better supply chain. And because of that, he could engage his army for the whole year and even more than a year at a stretch. So his wars were not seasonal. He could lay siege to a place for more than a year at a stretch, and that made him very powerful. So this person came to the west to attack the countries that were there. And look at Menahem's reaction. Menahem had no ability to fight against the Assyrians. He gave him tribute. I raised the question, this fellow is so rough and tough at home. He knows how to, rip open the stomachs of pregnant women. So what can he do with the Assyrian soldiers? Nothing. But it happens sometimes that people are very aggressive and very rough towards those who are delicate or weak. But when the real enemy comes, they do not have the ability to fight. And that was the case with Menahem. Some weeks back, I mentioned about the prophets of Israel. And I said that Nahum is one of the prophets about whom we don't know exactly when he wrote. That is, the Bible doesn't tell us when he wrote. But it's interesting that Josephus, the Jewish historian, says that Nahum prophesied during the reign of Jotham. That would be about the current time. That is the time when Assyria became very powerful, when Assyria was rising towards the zenith of its power. That is when Nahum prophesied about Assyria. Why is this interesting? Because the subject matter of the book of the prophet Nahum is God's judgment and destruction of Assyria. And he does that prophecy at a time when the nation is rising in power. Imagine when, at the time when, say, for example, in our day and age, when America is becoming a superpower, like becoming more and more powerful, at that time, imagine somebody prophesies about its destruction. So Nahum did something about that. Now, the point here is that God is in control and God knows about everything. Menahem is helpless at the Assyrian advance. Assyrians are becoming so powerful. Their kings are so clever, superior logistics, superior army, superior supply chains, becoming very powerful. Okay, Menahem cannot do anything about that. But while all this is happening, God is saying that a time is coming when Assyria is going to be judged, and Nahum was God's mouthpiece. Let us read 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 22. 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 22. And Menahem slept with his fathers, and Pekahiah his son reigned in his stead. So Menahem was the cruel king who paid tribute to Assyria, killed his own people, but then he died, and his son succeeded him. But if you go down a glance at verse 25, there was a person called Pekah, a captain of his army, and Pekah assassinated him, and he took the throne. That's what I said. There are a lot of names, and it can be confusing. So Menahem's son was Pekahiah, but he was quickly assassinated. And the person who took the throne, his name was Pekah. Let us read verse 27. 2 Kings 15, 27. In the 52nd year of Azariah, that is Uzziah, king of Judah, Pekah began to reign over Israel in Samaria, and he reigned for 20 years. So Pekah came to the throne, and he ruled for 20 years after assassinating the earlier king. When an assassin comes, one thing we can take for granted is that personal ambition must have been one of his motives. Somebody else is the king. Why should he be the king? Let me be the king. So personal ambition is his motive. And that's what must have driven Pekah to assassinate the earlier king and come to the throne. But there was perhaps another motivation also, and that is the dissatisfaction with Menahem's and Pekah's policy of paying tribute to Assyria. This tribute is a heavy burden. Every year, they have to pay a huge amount of money to Assyria. And Pekah was not happy with this. And he must have had his group of supporters who must have told him that, hey, you become the king, and you don't be so submissive to those Assyrians. We don't want to keep paying so much of tribute to them. So Pekah came to the throne, and what Pekah did, it's not mentioned here, but he got together with the surrounding kingdoms, Edom, Ammon, Moab, Syria, Tyre, Sidon, all these people. They got together and they attempted a rebellion against Assyria. They said, we don't want to pay this tribute year after year. So all these people got together and they tried to avoid paying tribute. So no doubt the news must have reached Pul, and he was not happy. Look at verse 29. Verse 29. In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, came Tiglath-Pileser. By the way, this is the same as the Pul of the previous reference. King of Assyria, the same king came, and he took Ijon, Abel-Beth-Makkah, Janoah, Keresh, Hazor, Gilead, Galilee, the land of Naphtali, and carried them captive to Assyria. And he carried them captive to Assyria. So these people tried to rebel, but the rebellion was not very successful. They incurred the wrath of the Assyrian king. So he came back the second time. He had two names. One name is Pul. The other name is Tiglath-Pileser, the third. And he came, and then he took part of Israel, that is the northeastern part of Israel. He took those people as captive. Deportation of the conquered population was one of the innovative strategies that this Assyrian emperor brought up. So he thought that if I deport people to another place, when they come to a new place, they will not try to act too smart. They will not try to foment rebellion. They will try their best to adjust to the new place, and they are captives there, and so they will be weak. So that is a good way to keep order in the kingdom. So that is what he thought, and that is why he deported the population of these northern parts of Israel. But even after he did all this, he must have thought to himself, this Assyrian emperor must have thought to himself that as long as Pekah is on the throne, the tribute from Israel is not guaranteed. And this fellow is the kind who is not submissive. He is the ringleader of these Edomites and Moabites and Ammonites, Syrians, all these people getting together with all of them, trying to avoid paying tribute. So as long as he is on the throne, my tribute is not guaranteed. So, he was not very happy with this King Pekah. Okay. Now let us read 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 30. 2 Kings 15:30. And Hoshea, the son of Elah, made a conspiracy against Pekah, the son of Remaliah, and smote him, and slew him, and reigned in his stead in the 20th year of Jotham, the son of Uzziah. So Pekah himself had come to the throne after assassinating someone. But now Hoshea, another person called Hoshea, comes, and he assassinates Pekah and becomes the king in his place. There was a person about 200 years ago called Sir Henry Rawlinson. Sir Henry Rawlinson. So I included his name in that image that I sent. He managed to decipher the Assyrian language. So in the process, he opened out a whole new world. So there were a lot of inscriptions found. He managed to decipher the language that the Assyrians were using. And so now archaeologists could read a lot of the things that Assyrians have written. And Tiglath-Pileser has devoted some of his journals or some of his writings to his Samaria campaign or his campaign to Israel. And these Assyrian inscriptions claim that we installed Hoshea, we got Pekah killed, and we installed Hoshea as the new king of Israel. That's what the Assyrians claim. So you can understand the situation here. Pekah is a person who is not wanting to pay tribute to Assyria, and the Assyrians knew it. So they wanted a king in Israel who was of the mind that we will pay the tribute. And Hoshea was that kind of person, pay tribute and have peace. So they propped Hosea up. They must have given him some support, and he assassinated Pekah, and he ascended the throne. So Hoshea was the favored king. It's like even today, if you have a powerful country like the US and you have small countries perhaps in the Middle East, and maybe there are some governments in the Middle East that are friendly or supportive to the US policy. So US would like that particular government, and there may be another government which is not supportive of their foreign policy, so they would not like them. So that was what is happening. Hoshea was more favorable to the Assyrians. They supported him, and he ascended the throne. Let us read now, skip a couple of chapters. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 2. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 2. And he, that is Hoshea, did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, but not as the kings of Israel that went before him. So just like the other kings of Israel, this is a report on Hoshea. And all his predecessors, it's almost a similar report that they all did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, just like Jeroboam, the first northern king. But here it says, this fellow also did evil, but not as much as the kings of Israel before him. So perhaps he was not so much steeped into the idolatry, the golden calves as they were, or perhaps he did not do the cruelty that Menahem and others had done. Josephus, the historian, says that Hoshea had no piety towards God. He had no spiritual connection. So perhaps he was somewhat decent in the way he treated the population. And that's why the author here says that he was not as bad as the earlier kings before him. Meanwhile, in Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser died, and his son succeeded him. And his son took on the royal name of Shalmaneser V. So in Assyria also there was a new king after a few years. Let us read 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 3. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 3. Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, And Hoshea became his servant and gave him presents. I said earlier that Hoshea was the person who was okay with paying tribute to Assyria. And he continued paying the tribute as long as the earlier king of Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser, was alive. When he died, Shalmaneser is trying to tell Hoshea that in case you had any doubts that your tribute paying time is over, I'm just come here to tell you that just as you paid tribute to us when my father was the emperor, you need to continue paying tribute even now that I have ascended the throne. So that's what Shalmaneser has come up and told him. And Hoshea gave tribute to Shalmaneser on that occasion. Now, this tribute must have been a heavy burden. Hoshea was ruling a depleted kingdom with depleted resources. And he had been paying tribute year after year to the earlier Assyrian king. And now the new king of Assyria has come. And Hoshea does not feel like continuing to pay this tribute. And as I said earlier, the people of Israel, along with Edom, Moab, Syria, Tyre, Ammon, all these people had tried to get together and they had tried to rebel against the nation of Assyria and avoid paying the tribute. But that attempt proved to be unsuccessful. The Assyrians were simply too powerful for all these people. So Hoshea must have been wondering, what can we do? How can we avoid paying this tribute? Even with combined forces, we are not able to match up with the Assyrians. We need the help of someone little more powerful. At that time, another superpower in the world was Egypt. It was on its decline, but it was still powerful. And Hoshea must have thought that perhaps if we get some help from Egypt, that would be good. But it was in the providence of God that at that time, Egypt was in some sort of chaos. There were various pharaohs who were fighting it out for different parts of Egypt. So they were all ruling parts of Egypt. And nobody was very powerful, but they were all, fighting it out. There was one king there. His name is So. Like in secular Egyptian history, there is a king whose name is Osorkon. And historians think that must be the same king mentioned here. In verse 4, there is a person mentioned called So, king of Egypt. He was ruling one corner of Egypt, the corner of Egypt closest to Israel. And what Hoshea did is that he made an alliance with this Egyptian king out of desperation. The tribute is such a heavy burden. So out of desperation, make an alliance with this king of Egypt, or Sorkon, or So. But So did not deliver on his promise. He did not give Hoshea the help that he promised. And when Hoshea missed paying his tribute, the Assyrians returned. Verse 4. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 4. And the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and he brought no present to the king of Assyria as he had done year by year. Therefore, the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. So the king of Assyria again came, the Assyrian army came, and Hoshea was forced to face them alone, and he got arrested. He got caught. I mean, there must have been some conflict. Hoshea, Samaria is the capital of Israel. Samaria is a fortified city. If the Assyrians captured Hoshea, it's not written here, but what must have happened is that Hoshea must have gone outside the city to meet them, to pacify them. Okay, if he was inside the city is fortified, then they cannot capture him. But he apparently went outside the city in order to pacify the Assyrians and said, okay, I'm sorry, now I will pay tribute. But they were not willing to listen to him. He was literally playing with fire. Okay, the Assyrians were cruel people, especially to those who did not accept their dominance. Hoshea was literally risking himself being skinned alive or burned alive. That was the kind of treatment that the Assyrians would give to those who did not accept their dominance. He went there, went out to meet them, pacify them. They arrested him. Okay, and then they laid siege to the land. Verse 5. Then the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land and went up to Samaria and besieged it for 3 years. So apparently, Hoshea is already arrested in verse 4 when he ventured outside the city. And now the city of Samaria is without the king, and the Assyrian army is invading it. But the people still put up some resistance. By the standards of that time, 3 years was a long time for people to resist a siege. But that is what they did. But then eventually they ran out of provisions. Verse 6. In the 9th year of Hoshea the king of Assyria, took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria and placed them in Hala and in Habor by the cities of Gozan and in the cities of the Medes. That is, they were deported to Iran and Iraq. So that this is the fall of Samaria, a big event in ancient history. The end of the northern kingdom of Israel. The king of Assyria came, he besieged the capital Samaria, he destroyed the city, and he took the people captive. It does not say how many people captive, but going with the Assyrian claims, around 30,000 people were taken captive, although the number is not given here. The year now is 722 BC. That is when the northern kingdom of Israel ended. Let us read verse 7 right here, 2 Kings 17:7. For so it was that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, which had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods. The author wants to make the reason for this clear. Yes, it is true that the Assyrians were very powerful. Yes, it is true that they had great logistics and all these things. But the reason that Israel fell is because of their disobedience to God. And we have been looking at the lives of these 2-3 last few kings of Israel. It has been a little difficult to trace, to understand all their names and what each person did. But I think you would have understood this much, that it was like between the devil and the deep sea for them. On the one hand, we have to pay tribute to Assyria. What is the alternative to that? Try a rebellion against Assyria. And when you try to rebel against Assyria, you don't have the strength to do it on your own. So we need the help of other people, Edom and Syria and all these other people, and Egypt, which proves to be so unreliable, running here and there for help, and the help is not forthcoming, burdened with a heavy tribute. And I don't know how Hoshea must have felt, when the Egyptians failed to help him. And if we had an opportunity to talk to him, probably he would tell us something that, I don't know what to do. Paid on the one hand, so much of tribute is there to be paid. Everybody is unhappy with that. But if I try to avoid that, I need the help of others, and nobody is willing to help us. The Egyptians are not sending the help that they promised. And now the Assyrians are again angry with us, and we are at risk for great cruelty at their hands. And we would feel like asking, Hoshea, how did you land up in this kind of situation? How did you land up between the devil and the deep sea, between the fire and the frying pan? How did you land up in this situation? And the author here is making it very clear. It is because of the disobedience. So the author of Kings gives us some details about the areas of disobedience. In verse 7, he says they feared other gods. In verse 17, verse 12, he says they served idols. In verse 12. So one of the sins of the people of Israel was to forsake the true God and worship false gods and indulge in idolatry. Then in verse 10, it says that they set up images and groves in every high hill and under every green tree. The mention of green tree gives a hint that there was some fascination with fertility. Evergreen trees are symbols of fertility. So the idolatrous religion that these people adopted had a fertility connection, because they wanted their population to increase, they wanted their animals to produce in large numbers and all that. So their religion involved this fertility cult, which also links to sexual immorality. So in ancient times, fertility religion would also involve sexual immorality as part of the rituals. There were shrine prostitutes that were there in these pagan temples. And that also would have led to general sexual immorality in the whole population. And then in verse 13 and 14, it says that they refused to listen to the many prophets that God had sent to them. That was another sin, refusing to heed the warnings of God. Verse 15, the first part says, they rejected his statutes and the covenant that he made with their fathers. They ignored the covenant. They disregarded the conditional covenant in which God had called for their allegiance and obedience, and God had promised to bless them in return. They forsook that covenant. They forsook the statutes also. God had given them civil laws also as to how economic life in the country is supposed to be conducted, how people are supposed to be treated. But these people indulged in violation of those statutes. In other words, there was a lot of economic injustice in the land. Rich people were oppressing the poor people. And the prophets speak of that. There was dishonesty in financial transactions, financial matters. That was one of the sins. Verse 17 says, they sacrificed their sons and daughters to pass through the fire. So there was human sacrifice, and along with that, witchcraft and sorcery. So these were the various sins of the people of Israel. And these are very serious and gross sounding sins. But you see the severe judgment of God. He handed them over to the Assyrians, who are a very cruel people. And we ought to ask ourselves, you see the seriousness of sin. The purpose of the Old Testament narratives, one of the purposes is to impress upon our minds the seriousness of sin and to tell us how much God hates sin. And that is what we need to take away. It's not rocket science, but it's just this, that as sinful human beings living in a wicked world, we just need these constant reminders to tell us how serious sin is in the sight of God. Let us read verse 24. 2 Kings 17:24. And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon and Kutha and Ava, Hamath, and from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel, and they possessed those places. As I said, this was an Assyrian practice to make people subservient. So just as the people of Israel were deported to Iran and Iraq, there were people from Iran and Iraq who were deported to Israel. Okay. And this must have been going on in various parts of the Assyrian kingdom. And in general, it is just a matter of new farmlands and new, maybe slightly different weather and slightly different lifestyle. Just do the same thing wherever you are. Okay, but this land was different, isn't it? This land was the land that Jehovah had given to the people of Israel. This was the land on which God had placed his name. This is not any other part of the Assyrian Empire. So things are not going to go normally here like they go in other places. Verse 25. And so it was at the beginning of the dwelling there that they feared not the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which slew some of them. In the prophets, God says that the Gentiles will glorify him. God will get glory from the Gentiles as well. And Israel had failed miserably, but this does not change who God is. And now these new people who have no idea of God, they would have to acknowledge him. They would have to acknowledge them. And you might feel like asking, oh, why did God send lions to kill them? You know, maybe Isaiah was living in Jerusalem at this time. You know, God could have just sent Isaiah there, and Isaiah could have gone and told these people, excuse me, I know you people have your own religion, but when you come here, we people are worshippers of the true God. You know, please worship the true God. And you know very well that these people, how would they react to Isaiah? I mean, your people have been taken captive from here. how do you expect us to believe that your God is the true God? He could not protect his own people. That would be their reaction. So by sending lions to attack these people, God is just speaking to them in the language that they understand. That is the language that they understand. So they took notice, they understood what was going on, and they sent a message to the Assyrian emperor saying that please send some priest or somebody from there who's a local of this place. Please send someone to us so that he can explain to us how we are supposed to serve the God of this place. And amazingly enough, the king agreed. And in verse 28, it says that one of those priests who had been taken captive from Samaria, he came and he dwelt at Bethel, that ancient place which is supposed to be the house of God. He came and dwelt there, and he taught these people about how they are supposed to worship the true God. Now, these people became the ancestors of the Samaritans that we meet in the New Testament. They're people from Iran and Iraq. They were brought here as captives to Israel. They learned the hard way that the God of Israel, he is the true God. We have to worship him. So they worshipped him. But if you read the further verses, it says that it was a mixed worship. They were serving God, that is Jehovah, partially, but partially they were also holding on to their idolatry. So gradually, as time progressed, these people developed some sort of Jewish religion. They're Samaritans. So they got hold of the Pentateuch and they started revering it as the scriptures. So till today, we have the Samaritan Pentateuch. That is, they accepted just the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and they started following that to the best of their knowledge. And Josephus, the Jewish historian, he complains that these people, whenever the Jews are doing well, they tend to associate themselves with the Jews, and they say that we are also one among you. And when the Jews are doing badly and have everything going against them, then these people claim that we are not Jews and we are very separate from them. Anyway, Josephus was from the Pharisees' party. So as a Jew, he must have not liked the Samaritans. But God's harshness with these people in sending lions and slowly them bringing them towards worship of the true God, it will bear fruit in the New Testament. In the New Testament, we have the exchange between the Samaritan woman and the Lord Jesus, all those villagers. And later on in the book of Acts, we see that many people turned to God. The ground was slowly being prepared. So Israel's captivity happened because of their disobedience, but that also meant that people from other countries came to the land. And at least in a slow and partial way, they learned something of the true God. Okay, so that was the story of the last few kings of the northern Israel. The southern kingdom is still intact and it is going on. But these were the last few kings of the northern kingdom. We see power struggles, we see brutality, we see no reverence to the office of the king, repeated assassinations, and we see the foreign power Assyria rising. Oppression, tribute, and desperate attempts to save themselves from the tribute. And one such attempt by Hoshea proved to be suicidal for him personally and also for the whole land. They got besieged and then they were taken captives. But the author makes it very clear that all this is happening because of the disobedience of the people of Israel. It didn't have to be this way. Even during David's time, Assyrian kings were there, but they didn't bother to attack Israel because Israel was strong at that time. So it didn't have to be this way. It became this way because of the disobedience of the people of Israel. So may God help us to just imprint these things on our mind and to be conscious of the seriousness of righteousness and evil, the seriousness of sin in the sight of God, and also to remember that God is sovereign. Yes, people are clever, skillful, brave, strong, etc. The Assyrians were that way, and they were thinking that we are the greatest people in the world. But it was all in the sovereignty of God. Without the Assyrians knowing, Nahum had already written the prophecy that foretold the destruction of the Assyrians themselves. So God is sovereign in everything that happens. but responsibility is there in our hands to do what is right and to avoid what is wrong. May God bless us.